Okay, video 9. So this is where we actually start to put it together. So, you made the big mess. We pulled everything out of the closet. We came up with the plan. We decided how we're going to arrange it. Now we're actually starting to put things back in the closet. This is going to be one of the longer videos because we're going to talk about a concept called iteration, but this is how we actually start to move forward, okay? Okay, so we're going to dive in and we're going to talk about a process called iteration. And iteration actually comes from this idea called continuous improvement. So if you've ever heard of continuous improvement, you're probably thinking, why are we talking about this in a relationship video? And I'll explain why. So continuous improvement, to go way back, comes from manufacturing, right? It actually came from manufacturing cars. And it's this idea of how you actually improve and change things, and it's the idea of doing it small and steady. So if you imagine on a manufacturing floor, you're trying to figure out how to manufacture things better, faster, stronger. And what you do is you look at the entire process, you pick out teeny tiny pieces, and you make changes, little tiny piece at a time. Also important is you're continually assessing whether or not those tiny changes are being helpful or not, and then shifting and adjusting. The reason we're applying this to relationships is even though it started with manufacturing, this process and this idea is now used all over the place because it is incredibly successful. So instead of trying to change everything all at once, you're trying to change tiny things and you're practicing this process of learning and growing. So within your relationship, we've started this. You didn't know it was happening, but we unpacked all kinds of stuff, right? So we looked at what is going well and what isn't going well within your relationship. We looked at what you want your relationship to look like, and we brainstormed a whole bunch of tools. So imagine it's all kind of laid out in front of you. What we're going to start doing now is finding teeny tiny places to make changes. And my goal is that you get this sense of momentum. When we change one tiny thing at a time, it's actually approachable. If you tried to fix everything on all these worksheets all at once, we would fail in a flaming ball of failure, right? It's just not possible. But when we do one tiny thing at a time, we build momentum and then we actually start to grow and shift. Okay? So let's kind of go back and I'll talk about what I mean by iteration. So here are the three important things to remember. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about building some iterative changes within your relationship. And this very fancy graphic shows you what iteration looks like. And it means you take something very small and simple. So let's say that you are struggling with finances. So you take one tiny little piece of your financial struggle and you try an experiment. You say, instead of doing it this way, we're going to experiment and try this. Then you assess how that went. You review it, okay? So you come up with something small and tiny and specific. You experiment with it. You review how it went, and then you start again. I'll continue showing what this means. Okay? So what I want to do is I actually want to do a case study. I think that that'll make it a little bit clearer. So let's do a case study on Frank and Fran, who are completely fictional. So if this sounds familiar to you, don't worry, it's fictional. But they have some pretty common stuff going on in their relationship. So Frank and Fran have been married for 6 years. Frank is a paramedic. He's been a paramedic for most of their relationship. And Fran used to teach second grade, but since they had children, she's decided to stay home with the kids. They have two kids whose ages are 3 and 18 months. And they kind of have gone through some shifts. So Frank has always loved being a paramedic, but his community is growing, right? So the kind of the makeup of the community is shifting, which means his work as a paramedic is shifting. They run a lot more calls. They're struggling with a lot more homelessness, a lot more calls for overdoses, stuff like that. So the actual makeup of his day has kind of shifted, and he's a lot busier. Plus, now he has two little kids. Fran loved teaching. She really loved working. And even though she really likes staying home with her kids, she's struggling because it's different. So she's home with two littles. Their kids are 3 years old and 18 months old. They're small. And so there's some shifts in her, how things are going for her day to day. And they're finding that not only are they having trouble individually, but they're fighting more within their relationship. They're having a harder time. Okay? This is not at all uncommon. So if it sounds familiar, it's because it's super, super common. So let's say that Frank and Fran worked through the 9 different things, right? They're doing the worksheet, they're doing this boot camp. They worked through their 9 things and they identified a bunch of things that are going well and a bunch of things they're struggling with. And one of the things they really noticed was that idea of transition was super hard and the communication around transition was super hard. So they realized that they've been having a bunch of fights lately that arise when both of them have a really bad day, right? So if anyone has stayed home all day with two little kids, you know you can have some really rough days. And if you're a paramedic, obviously you can have some really rough days. So they have had several gigantic blow up fights recently when both partners were having a really hard day. They got home at the end of the shift. Frank came home at the end of the shift. He wanted a little support from Fran. He wanted her to give him some space to go for a jog and just kind of decompress and relax. She had been home with little kids all day. She wanted him to take the kids so she could just take a moment and have a shower to herself, right? So they both needed the other one to support their needs. And then they were both extremely frustrated and got into a big fight about whose needs were the most important. Okay? Again, not an uncommon situation. So for Frank and Fran, what they decided to do is work through this process of iteration. And the first thing they did is they identified what's going on, right? So it's this kind of breakdown of communication on really bad days. Then they decided, okay, what would be one tiny thing that we could do to address this problem? How do we make this small and approachable? If we make it too big, we're going to fail. They're both at the end of their ropes and exhausted. It has to be tiny. And so as they kept talking about it, they realized that one of the issues was the communication. So they were both having a really bad day. They didn't know the other one was having a really bad day. And then the blow up happened at home. So they decided that their first iteration, their first experiment, was going to be around this idea of just helping know when the other is having a really bad day. And they came up with this really simple idea of red, yellow, green. So before Frank got in the car to drive home, he texted red, yellow, green to Fran. That just means I'm either doing red, I'm doing yellow, or I'm doing green, right? Super straightforward. This is the goal of any iteration. Very simple, okay? Fran likewise would text back red, yellow, green. So then they could kind of know before he got home, how are we doing? Red, yellow, green. They did this experiment for a week. Okay, so very simple experiment, small time frame. You do it for a small time frame, and then you review how it goes. So Frank and Fran did red, yellow, green for 1 week, and then they sat down and discussed how it went. Okay, pretty straightforward. And what they noticed is red, yellow, green was really helpful in a couple days when one partner was red and another one was yellow. So they were both struggling, but because they were able to identify that one was struggling more, then they were more prepared to kind of balance the needs, right? So if, let's say, if Frank's the one who had a really, really awful call that day, Fran knows he needs to take a quick jog when he gets home, and she knows she's going to have the kids longer. Okay, so they're able to work as a partner because they've communicated, work as partners because they've communicated. When they're reviewing, they also realized this process didn't work as well on one day when they were both red. So there was one day when they both texted red. And what they noticed is that 15 minutes it took for Frank to drive home, they were both kind of mentally preparing their argument about why their needs were more important than the others. And then they ended up having the same fight. Okay? So what they learned is some parts of the system were very helpful, some were not. It just gave them more time to mentally prepare for a fight. Okay, so this was their first iteration. So once they reviewed and saw what worked well and what didn't, then they decided, what do we want to do for our second iteration? Do we want to try something completely new, or do we just want to adjust to this one and see if we can make it work a little bit better? Okay, so they talked about what went well, what didn't, and then how they want to proceed. Frank and Fran decided, well, this worked pretty well except for those red days. So what if instead of texting right before Frank comes home, which gives him about 15 minutes, they text about an hour. Frank would do everything he could to text about an hour before he came home. So then they have an hour of time to kind of prepare if there's a double red day. So their next iteration, same red, yellow, green, very simple, but instead they're trying to text an hour ahead of time in order to prepare. They also both committed to, if there's a double red day, committed to being partners in that and seeking to find ways to support each other versus put their needs ahead and come up with an argument for why theirs was more important. Okay? So in their second iteration is an hour ahead of time and figuring out how that worked. So imagine they do that for a week, they fast forward, that actually worked really well. Okay, so then they've decided, great, so this is actually a really helpful system. We're going to keep our red, yellow, green text messages as kind of an ongoing part of our relationship. And then they can decide, okay, do we work on something else, or do we continue strengthening this communication piece? We can imagine, one way they could go is Frank and Fran could say, okay, our third iteration is going to be strengthening this system. And one thing we want to do is make sure we improve our toolbox for those double red days, right? So on a double red day, you're going to need some options for what to do with the kids. If we're both literally at the end of our ropes, it may not be that one person has to kind of take the bullet and the other person gets their needs met. It may be that we call in grandma, or we put the kids in front of the TV. And so they built kind of a list of tools that they could use on double red days. One thing that's important to note is if you're having a really bad day, that is not the time to brainstorm tools. You need to think about your tools ahead of them, so then when you're just really struggling and having a bad day, you already have them set. So Frank and Fran in their third iteration could come up with their list of tools, and then they would be ready. Okay, hopefully that case study is helpful. Hopefully it highlights this idea that when you try one little thing at a time, then you can realize what's working, and at the end of the day, it's strengthening your partnership and your teamwork and your communication. Okay, so we want you to be working as a team to improve your relationship. We want you to feel a sense of connection, momentum, commitment, stuff like that, and iteration really helps with that. You can continue doing these little iterations for as long as you need. So if there is stuff that is still causing tension, continue to experiment and try new things. If you're doing pretty well, go ahead and stop. This isn't the kind of thing you have to do every day for the rest of your life. But it is a skill. And what I want you to keep in mind is that moments when you have tension or struggle, this is a skill you can pull in. And remember how we kind of defined your season. Your season will shift, right? So if you have toddlers right now, at some point they're going to become tweens. You're going to have different needs. And this process of kind of iterating through and figuring out the systems and tools within your partnership can be a really important skill and tool to help you remain strong in the midst of all those changes and shifts. Okay. So in the next video, this was kind of long. I know I was really kind of taking a lot of time to unpack it, but in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to go through a guided brainstorm session for you specifically to help plan out these first few iterations. See you then.